Okay, thank you everyone so much for being here. I'm going to introduce Dr. Eric Goodman to you. Dr. Eric Goodman is a clinical psychologist and anxiety disorder and OCD specialist in private practice in San Luis Obispo and an adjunct faculty member at California Polytechnic State University. He is author of the books Social Courage, Coping and Thriving with the Reality of Social Anxiety, Your Anxiety Beast and You, A Compassionate Guide to Living in an Increasingly Anxious World, and the upcoming book, The Mindful Freakout, a rescue manual for being at your best when life is at its worst. So we're so grateful to be learning from Dr. Goodman again today, and I will pass it off to him to take us away.
Thank you, Chrissy. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. So, so I'm happy to see everybody. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, anxiety. And this topic kind of was something I started thinking about when I was in grad school. And I was slated to give a talk at the American Psychological Association. And the problem was I had a crippling public speaking phobia at the time. And I was kind of naive, and I thought, learning to be a psychologist, I was going to learn how to never feel anxious in situations. And so the talk was at the end of the conference. I think it was on the last day, and so I had about 4 days to try to figure out the secret to not feeling anxious public speaking. So I went to every talk I could find on social anxiety and public speaking fears. And I was really disappointed to learn that there is no research that has ever existed that shows that there's a way we can take someone from clinical anxiety to zero anxiety. And we can help people reduce it quite a bit, but in my phobic mind state, that was incredibly disappointing. And so that leaves us with the reality that anxiety is a part of life, and we need to learn how to live with it in a more adaptive way. So let me, so disclosure, I do get a few royalties. So today we're going to talk about a different way to look at anxiety from how it's often presented. And so I'm going to intermingle concepts and strategies from compassion-focused therapy and ACT to target the experience of suffering with anxiety and how to live a values-based life, even when anxiety shows up. But I'm also going to talk about what I think is kind of the most exciting thing to happen to exposure therapy in my career, which is an inhibitory learning approach to exposure therapy. And so I'm going to explain that and how we use that. And the goal is to try to make exposure therapy optimal. I'm not going to go too much into the nitty-gritty of compassion-focused therapy or ACT just because of time constraints. But as Chrissy pointed out, I did give a talk with this group last year, and it covered in more detail those concepts. So people these days have very mistaken beliefs about anxiety, and their mistaken beliefs makes them suffer. People conceptualize anxiety as a disease that can and needs to be cured, or an antagonist that needs to be vanquished once and for all. And it makes sense that people feel this way because anxiety is really uncomfortable. And anxiety tends to focus around things that matter to us. So Stephen Hayes, who's one of the founders of ACT, he talks in terms of we hurt where we care. If you care about social connection, you're more likely to have social anxiety, for example. And so anxiety can try to make us miss out on things that we really care about. And because anxiety is this internal experience that we're noticing, when we look at other people, we don't see it. And so it can give people the impression that they're the only ones that are feeling this thing where other people are not. And at the same time, we live in a society that demonizes anxiety and causes us to be more and more anxious. So what do people do when they first wake up in the morning, planet-wide nowadays? They reach for this, right? All throughout the world. And that starts the daily barrage of media and images that are really messing with our species. So we're constantly exposed to images of people living this calm, peaceful, joyful, perfectly happy life. And then we have social media and things like TikTok that is telling you, hey, watch my 30-second video dancing around talking about anxiety, and you're going to be anxiety free forever. And I think that social media is probably one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And then we're binge watching stuff. We have access to so much content where, again, we're being given the impression that there is some way to live your life just right. And on top of that, there's more and more sophisticated advertisements that they're monitoring us, and they're finding out what's our deepest desires and our deepest insecurities. And then it's sending us tailored advertisements that give us the impression that there's something really wrong with us, that if we can purchase this product or service, then we're going to kind of achieve some sort of lasting peace. And this is before AI starts to really get involved in advertising. And that's if that's not here now, it's coming quickly. And so we're kind of a FOMO species right now. If you don't know what FOMO is, it's this called the fear of missing out. And so we are living with these unrealistic expectations of how our life is supposed to be. And it makes us feel like we're somehow different and we're somehow not doing our life right.
Right now.
And then on top of that, we got the 24-hour news cycle. And for those of you around my age or older, you grew up with news that was kind of boring. It was just about providing information about what's going on. Now that's gone. The news is fighting for our attention because there's so many sources. And so the business model of news now is, how do we scare the living daylights out of people so they'll keep clicking again and again and again? And our homes and our beds are now being invaded by these images and messages that are really truly anxiety provoking. And now enter a lot of experts who have written what I think are wonderful books, and I'm not really putting down these books per se, and some of them are on my bookshelf right behind me. But the marketing of these books, if you take a look at these titles, They are marketing their book as a cure to a disease or a weapon against an enemy, that there is some way that you are never going to worry again. You're never going to feel anxious again. And anytime you've ever heard the term anxiety-free, that's never been real. That's always been marketing hype that is just fake. And with all of this, anxiety levels are rising across the board, and they have been for some time. Not just anxiety, but depression and suicidal ideation. And there was research the year before COVID, when they polled high school students across the country, 1 in 10 had attempted suicide in the year before. And I know that sounds shocking. And I had put that in a book, and then I woke up in the middle of the night. I said, oh my God, I put this statistic in this book. It can't possibly be true. I go back to the CDC research, and yeah, it's true. It's disturbing, and it's growing. And we have this cultural shift on caregiving and child expectations that are worsening anxiety. And again, for those of you my age or older, we were raised very differently. And now we have the helicopter and snowplow parenting where we're over involved in our kids' lives. We're over scheduling them. And the young people are not okay. They are very stressed and very anxious. And so, again, we have society is creating all this anxiety while demonizing it. And so what are the costs of buying into this notion that anxiety is our enemy? Well, we're not going to get rid of it. We're not going to actually become anxiety-free. And so we're going to fail. You buy a book that tells you, become anxiety-free in 6 easy steps. That's not going to happen. It's not going to work. And you're going to be living with an enemy in your head. And so what happens is when anxiety is the enemy, and inevitably anxiety is going to show up, whether you're going to a party where you don't know a lot of people and you have a little bit of anxiety. And then you think, oh my God, how terrible it is that I feel anxious. Now you're anxious about your anxiety. And then you realize, oh man, I'm anxious about my anxiety, and you feel anxious about that. And then you begin to feel sad. This is my life. I can't get rid of my anxiety. What a loser I am. And then you might feel guilty because there's people dying in the world, and here I am feeling bad about anxiety. So what starts out with this kind of clean anxiety ends up with a whole lot of extra suffering. So the question is it true that anxiety is actually the villain in your life story? No, it's actually not. So we can reframe anxiety as a hero, a deeply flawed one, but a hero. And when I wrote my second book, I was thinking about the fairy tale Beauty and the Beast, where you think the beast is the villain at the beginning of the movie or the story, and only later does it turn out that the beast is this misguided hero. And so I've used that as an analogy for anxiety for quite some time. So what is anxiety? Right? Really, not metaphor aside, what's its function? Why do we experience it? It's here to protect us against threats. It's an important part of our life, and even high amounts of anxiety at times is normal. Anxiety's job is to scan the environment, whether it's internal environment or external environment, looking for threats. And it's designed to jump into action at the slightest sign of a threat. And it it tries to help us by giving us these minor superpowers. It makes us focus intently on whatever it perceives to be a threat. Now, if you're being chased by a bear, that's wonderful. You don't want to stop and smell the roses or admire the sunset. You want to laser focus on the threat. And that's what anxiety does for us. And, you know, you could be lounging on a hammock while camping, feeling very relaxed, and you see a bear coming towards you. You're going to get flooded with energy, which is going to help you do what you need to do to survive. So our cardiovascular system gets turbocharged. We're getting more oxygen to the muscles. We're getting that adrenaline boost. And we become physically more powerful. When we feel under threat, our muscles just tighten. So when you see someone tensed up, that's their muscles tighten to prepare them for battle. You don't want to go into battle like this. You want to go into battle with your muscles tight. And another kind of cool thing is that our blood flow gets diverted from non-essential functions to give us that extra boost. And our anxiety is designed to give us protection. So it activates feelings of dread. That's those things we don't enjoy feeling, but we don't enjoy feeling them because it's designed to motivate us to take protective action. It has to be intense in order to grab our attention and protect us. Blood moves away from the surface of our body. It pools to protect the inner organs so that our inner organs are protected, and we're less likely to bleed out if we get bit by a saber-toothed tiger on the arm. We sweat when we're anxious to cool us down so we don't overheat. It makes us more slippery, so we're less likely to get grabbed onto. And some of us blush as an appeasement signal to potential aggressors. And so all of that physical process is designed to give us a good battle plan. So if the threat is something that we perceive that we can overcome without too high of a cost, we fight. If we don't think we can defeat the threat or the cost would be too high, we flee. If we don't think we can get away, and if we don't think we can defeat it, we freeze and hope the threat doesn't see us. And if we get caught and we can't get away, then we're going to engage in some sort of appeasement reflex in order to hopefully get the threat to move away from us. And it's important to understand we need anxiety to survive. The real world isn't necessarily as dangerous as it once was, but is still dangerous at times. And imagine if you don't have anxiety, if you were to cure your anxiety, never feel it, and you're driving on the highway and the car in front of you slams on its brakes, you're not going to make it. We need our anxiety. And on top of that, moderate anxiety is best for peak performance if you have some task that you need to overcome, whether it's giving a talk or taking a test. That's that Yerkes-Dodson principle that you likely learned about in grad school. Too little anxiety. So if you're showing up to give a presentation or take a test and you're lethargic, it's not going to go well. If you're having panic attacks, it probably won't go well. But we need moderate amounts of anxiety. Now, just like when you take a medication and you see on the commercials side effects on such and such medication include all these things. Well, the side effects of anxiety include a lot of pretty unpleasant stuff. And so there's reasons why it feels unpleasant and we don't always like it when it shows up. So the thing to recognize, and I think to help our clients recognize, is that anxiety is trying to do the right thing. It's trying to protect us. It's trying to help us. But in the modern world, it's typically doing the right thing at the wrong time. So it's misperceiving threats. So I like to say that like all heroes, it has a weakness, and for anxiety, it's recognizing the context. So it can misperceive threats that are external or internal, such as our anxiety can see our body sensations as a threat. So our increased heart rate means we're going to have a heart attack, or our emotions are a threat. Or with a lot of my clients with OCD, they notice their thoughts and then they start to panic about their thoughts, misperceiving normal, albeit unpleasant thoughts as being a threat. Or in PTSD, memories can be seen as a threat, or for other things, urges and impulses seen as a threat. So why is our anxiety so glitchy? Why is it misperceiving so much stuff? So to answer this question, with all my clients, and again, my practice is predominantly anxiety disorders and OCD. And so I ask every one of my clients during the psychoeducation session, who is the toughest animal on the planet? And if you're willing, let's see if I can do the chat. Take a guess and just, if you want to, type in which animal is the toughest animal on the planet. Let's just see what you come up with. The first person just got it right. So we got shark, we got ants, so killer whale, hippo, and honey badger. Now, my clients when I started asking this question, at some point somebody mentioned a honey badger. I had never heard of a honey badger. And when I learned about a honey badger, I literally lost a week of my life to YouTube videos on honey badgers. And if you haven't looked at YouTube videos of honey badgers, I highly recommend it. So we talk about, all right, well, all living creatures if they have survived to this point in the evolutionary history, they have developed things to give them a survival advantage. So the ants are really small, can fit into confined spaces. The shark can swim fast and's got those rows of teeth, and lions can jump high and they got the claws and the fangs. But they're not the toughest. And so for that, it's kind of a trick question, because we forget that we're animals also. Now, humans are by far the toughest dominant animal on the species. We don't, there's not another animal that's competing with us for the top of the food chain. And so think about that. We're not fast like a cheetah. We don't have a hard shell like a crab. We don't have the claws and the fangs. We're not strong like a gorilla, right? So why are we the toughest animals on the planet? What is our survival advantage that is so far better than all those other survival advantages? Well, we got these big complex brains that worry a lot. And so let's talk a little bit more about how that makes us top of the food chain. So if you imagine a zebra on the Serengeti is attacked by a lion, and once it notices that lion chasing after it, it's going to have a zebra panic attack. It's going to have that fight or flight activated in a really big way. And if it survives and it gets back to its herd, within minutes, its blood pressure goes back to normal, heart rate goes back to normal, and it's drinking the water from the stream and eating the grass and playing with the other zebras. No harm, no foul. But what happens to the human that gets attacked by the lion, barely survives, gets back to its herd? What happens? It begins ruminating over what happened. Oh my God, I was almost eaten by a lion. Can you imagine what would have happened? That would have been awful. What would I have done? And also, and maybe more importantly, we anticipate what could happen tomorrow or the next day or next year. We think about, what do I do? Do I bring a rock? Do I bring a stick? Do I bring other people? Maybe I should just avoid going places where there are lions. And so that rumination and anticipation, that's our superpower. That's why we are so dominant on the planet. We don't need to have a threat imminent for us to have a fight or flight response. We can have an infinite number of threats that our body reacts to just with our own thoughts. And it works really well. We have a modern civilization. We got cooked food. We got technology. We're all over the world right now talking to each other through this screen, and that's miraculous. So it comes with that dark side, our rumination and anticipation superpowers. Makes us the most anxious animal that we know of on the planet. And our brains have a threat bias. So think about it this way. You go to a party and you have 9 really pleasant interactions with someone. And one person that you haven't seen for all, you go up to say hi to them, and they just walk right past you and give you no attention whatsoever. And you're in the car later and you're driving back. What do you think about? What do you remember? Do you remember the 9 pleasant interactions you have? Probably not. Probably not. You're probably thinking about the one person that treated you rudely. Now, our anxiety has worked great for millions of years. Now, think about it this way. There were, and I think a lot of us forget this, there were about 14 that we know of human-like hominids. So like us and the Neanderthals, there's 14. We're the only ones that survived. So something about us worked better than for our competition. So here's how I think about it. We've been around in one form or another for about 3.5 million years. So if this is 3.5 million years, right? We're hunter-gatherer nomads, hunter-gatherer nomads, hunter-gatherer nomads, hunter-gatherer nomads, hunter-gatherer nomads, iPhones. So the world changed very, very quickly overnight. And so if you think about, we've been around 250,000 years as Homo sapiens, through 3 million years, give or take, as our hominid ancestors. The agricultural revolution, where we started having an actual civilization, that was only about 10,000 years ago. And again, for those of you who are my age or older, you know that the world that the young people are growing up in now, it's incredibly different from the world we grew up in. So anxiety didn't change. Anxiety is still the same that it's been for millions of years. We changed, and we changed quickly. And by we, I mean our culture. So Another thing about anxiety is we need it. We would be at significant risk without it. And I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about this because of timing, but I want to point out there have been people who through brain injuries have lost the ability to experience anxiety about things out in the world. And I put a link to a podcast where they interview this person. They use her initials SM because they don't want to reveal who she is because she's so at risk to being taken advantage of because she doesn't experience anxiety of anything out in the world. And because of that, her life has been kind of one series of dangerous, risky things after another. So bottom line is we need to teach our clients that anxiety is not pathology. Anxiety is not a problem in and of itself. Anxiety is a normal human emotion. So if they're experiencing anxiety and TikTok tells them that they're defective because of that, we want to help them to understand that they're not broken, they're not pathological, weak, they're not defective. And it's not their fault that they experience anxiety. It's not our fault that our nervous systems were designed in the way that they were. We didn't do it. We kind of inherited this. And the other thing we want to help people understand is that there are no cures to anxiety. There's no cures. We're going to be anxious intermittently our entire lifespan. That's not pathology. And even if there were a way to cure anxiety, it would put us at great risk. We would be in big trouble. Kind of like the people that are born without pain receptors and they lean on a stovetop and they wonder what smells like chicken, right? We need anxiety. Without it, we're going to do very risky things. So an alternative to striving for anxiety-free for ourselves and for our clients, we can have some alternative goals. So we can have a better relationship with our anxiety. And I had a lot of my clients are Cal Poly college students, and I had one after I did the psychoeducation, gave me this wonderful analogy. He said, "Oh, so it's like if you're a freshman and you're given a random roommate on campus, and you don't really like the roommate, but you're going to have to live with them for a long time. So you better get along with them, or your life is going to be a living nightmare, right?" So we want to improve our relationship with anxiety, and that means making our home and our nervous system, making our nervous system a better home for anxiety. We want to teach anxiety rather than hide from it or fight from it. I think someone's microphone's on. If you're able to mute that, please. And we want to bring anxiety with us willingly as we go out in the world and live a values-based life rather than an emotion-driven or an avoidant life. So just really briefly with this, when I'm talking about giving our anxiety a good home in our nervous system, those are those things that you all help your clients with, right? That if they're not sleeping well, right? One poor night's sleep will make anxiety 30% louder on average. If they're not exercising, if they're, a lot of my college student clients, they binge drink because that's what they think they need to do. And they binge drink, and the next day they're going to have that, what we call hangxiety. They get that hangover anxiety where they're going to feel they're going to experience anxiety a lot louder because they've made their nervous system a worse place for their inner protectors to be. And they can choose that if they want, but it does come at that cost. And so, all these things like mindfulness practices, taking care of our health, taking medications if we need it, working on stress management, those are all things we can do not to destroy or vanquish or cure our anxiety, but to give it a better home in our nervous system. So it's less feisty. Now, so if anxiety is not the problem, and it isn't, when my clients come to me, what is the problem? The problem is when they have a phobic relationship with their anxiety. And that's where we see disordered anxiety, like anxiety disorders, OCD, and related sorts of things. And so this might be a review for some, but just to kind of understand how the phobic cycle works. And all anxiety disorders and OCD work in this way. So let's say someone has a phobia of dogs. And so they're walking down the street and they see from a distance a dog is coming their way. Their brain is going to make a danger interpretation, right? And if they didn't have a phobia, if they love dogs, their brain's going to make a more pleasant interpretation. But if someone has a phobia of dogs, their brain is going to say something along the lines of, oh my God, this thing's going to hurt me or kill me. And when the brain interprets something as a threat, it is logical and often helpful for it to activate a threat emotion like anxiety. And that is going to lead the person with a phobia to have an instinct or an urge to avoid the dog if they can. If they can't use, they can use safety behaviors, like if they're walking with their friend, they can stand behind them and use their friend as a human shield, right? So these are safety behaviors. And the thing we want to understand is that our anxiety, in addition to having the job of looking for threats and activating that fight or flight when it perceives a threat or misperceives a threat, its job is also to learn about what's a threat. And so I like to think that our anxiety kind of walks around with a clipboard and a pen. And it's trying to write down what's a threat and what's not a threat. And so when our anxiety bodyguard sees us turn around or cross the street because there's a dog, or it sees us do these safety behaviors, what's it writing down about dogs? It's writing down, oh, dogs are threats. And so in that way, we're teaching our anxiety threat about that trigger, like dogs, could be anything. And it's missing the opportunity to learn that the threat is not actually a threat. And so if instead of turning and running from the dog, we kind of kneel down and we pet the dog, assuming the dog is your run-of-the-mill friendly dog, and spend time with that dog, then we're going to be teaching anxiety something different. So instead of avoidance and safety behaviors, which is the culprit in all things phobic, we can choose to act with psychological flexibility. And so ACT capitalized because it stands for acceptance and commitment therapy, which is that school of therapy that is about psychological flexibility. Psychological flexibility is, I'm nervous, I'm scared, but that thing is important to me, so I'm going to move towards it anyways. Or, the person cut me off in traffic and I'm having the instinct to road rage them. And instead, I'm going to follow my value of not engaging, right? So that's psychological flexibility, which is considered probably the most important concept in mental health. And so what I have down here is the different ACT core processes that I'm gonna not go into them. I go into them in the talk I gave here a year ago, but basically it is about getting off autopilot, turning towards the discomfort rather than avoiding or fighting it, and taking values-based action. So when it comes to anxiety, we get triggered, we want to wake up rather than be on kind of automatic threat reaction. We want to wake up. We want to turn towards the feelings rather than running from it. And then we want to commit to facing the fear if it's of value to you, right? We don't have to face our fears, right? There's no law that says we have to face it. There's a lot of things that scare the living daylights out of me that I am really frightened about, like bungee jumping, for example, that it is not values-based for me to face that fear. So I'm perfectly content being terrified to bungee jump and never teaching my anxiety that it's safe, because it isn't important to me or my life or my future. So facing fears. So I often tell my clients that either you train your anxiety or your anxiety trains you. So ERP stands for exposure with response prevention. And what that means is we face the fears, exposure, without doing those safety things that aren't actually keeping us safe. So, so this means that we got to do things that are initially difficult. It is hard to face a fear. Facing a fear is short-term pain for longer-term gain. Avoiding a fear is short-term gain for long-term pain. So I was taught, and probably many of you were taught, the habituation model of exposure therapy back in grad school. And there's this somewhat newer approach called an inhibitory learning model. I'm going to talk about both of those and why I think the inhibitory learning model is the way to go. So with the habituation model, and many of you are going to remember this, we were told you have your client face the fear. So you put them in a room with the dog, and you wait until the fear subsides by 50%. And we were always warned, don't stop the exposure until their anxiety habituates by 50%, or you're going to damage your clients. And the habituation model talked about creating a fear hierarchy, right? If you remember that, and starting with an easier challenge and moving up the hierarchy step by step. And what we were told, in this way, you're extinguishing the fear. You are unlearning the fear. Now, the habituation model, absolutely, it's an effective intervention, but there are some issues. First of all, and this was the thing that really, people who are anxiety specialists like myself, this was the thing that really kind of, got us practicing differently around 2014, when some research came out that showed that within session habituation is not at all correlated with habituation long-term or long-term treatment. So whether your client habituates during an exposure in session isn't actually correlated with long-term outcome. And that was the thing that kind of blew our minds. Now, here's the other issue with thinking about an extinction model, where I'm gonna face something until I extinguish a fear. It has never been a real thing. There is no delete button on in the human nervous system. So fears are forever. Fears are forever. We do not undo things. There's no delete button. We can add stuff, but we cannot delete. Now, the other problem with a habituation model is that for some of our clients, habituation within session becomes a safety behavior where they're feeling anxious and they go, all right, I have to do my exposure therapy to habituate. And they do it in this kind of controlling, desperate sort of way, which can actually make it worse. Or if you're just over-relying because it works for you, you're still making anxiety into a threat. I have to habituate because anxiety is this big bad thing. And you're threat associating fear. Now, the other thing is effectiveness is limited. So most people get 70 to 85% of people will benefit. And so that's actually a pretty good thing. But only 55% of people who do exposure therapy will achieve normative functioning. And that's not anxiety-free. That's just normative functioning. That leaves us, however, with 15 to 30% of people who don't benefit. And here's the other thing that's really challenging is that relapse is often the rule, not the exception. So 19 to 60% of the time, depending on what research study you're looking at and what disorder you're talking about. I think the 62% of the time was panic disorder. But 19 to 62% of the time, return of fear happens. So there is no extinguishing of fear. So return of fear can be caused by a number of things. So passage of time being one. And if you remember working with clients before the COVID lockdown who were experiencing social anxiety, and you're working so hard to get them to go out and to meet people, and you start to make progress with them, and then the world shuts down for a year or so, and there is no socializing. And a lot of our clients, their social fears just came back, unfortunately. That was really frustrating for so many of us. A return of fear can also be caused by encountering the trigger in a new context. So like for me with my public speaking phobia, I did a lot of exposure. You know, I teach at Cal Poly, I do hours and hours of public speaking. But every time there is a radically new context, so like the first time I did something like this, my phobia wakes up. And it's just kind of a teaching process again. And you've probably seen that in your clients, right? That anxiety learns threat in a very general, broad way. So that if you get terrified and you know, mauled by a dog, for example, hope that doesn't happen, but if it happens, you're going to be wary of all, initially at least, all little furry creatures everywhere. And it could be, you know, you see a cat running out there and your anxiety is going to freak out, right? Maybe even a squirrel, right? So we learn threats quickly and broadly, but we learn safety in a more piecemeal way. And the other thing that can lead to return of fear is getting re-traumatized. So you're doing exposure therapy with dogs, everything's going great. The person now is not so much afraid of dogs. And then they get bit or scared, frightened by or chased by a dog or whatever. That is much more likely to wake up a phobia in them than someone who never had a phobia to start with. So the way I think about the inhibitory learning approach is that's teaching our anxiety guard dog new things. So the focus isn't on habituation, but it's on learning new stuff, safety learning. And the link here at the bottom is a kind of a real comprehensive, great article on inhibitory learning by the person that came up with that, and that's Michelle Krask, who's a researcher, a real eminent researcher on anxiety disorders at UCLA. So exposure therapy does not extinguish a fear. It creates competing learning. So in my brain, in my nervous system, I have competing learning. I have the learning that public speaking is a threat, that it's dangerous. And that's never going to go away because there's no delete button in the human nervous system. But I have worked really hard to build up new learning, safety learning, that public speaking is safe. Those two things, they compete with each other, and the stronger one inhibits the weaker one. So that's what inhibitory learning is. So you're faced with a task or a trigger, for example, for whatever fear. If you treat it like it's a danger, you are strengthening that danger learning. If you treat it like it's safe, you're strengthening that safety learning. And again, whichever one is stronger inhibits the weaker one. So we want to create the most powerful safety learning experiences that we can. And inhibitory learning gives us a number of really simple, good approaches for that. So training our anxiety. So first of all, we, instead of creating an exposure hierarchy, like you probably learned in grad school, we create exposure menus. So we're not going to do things in this stepwise sort of thing, at least not by default, because there is some advantage to sometimes doing something harder, sometimes doing something easier, sometimes doing something as moderate. So mixing up these challenges seems to have an added benefit. And I think that it's because life doesn't present triggers to us in this nice, neat, stepwise, hierarchical way. Life presents us triggers that are all over the place. Now, I've done this for quite some time, and occasionally I have clients who will only agree to starting at a very low level and work up in a very slow hierarchical sort of way. I don't think it's optimal, but you have to meet your clients where they're at. And if that's what they're willing to do versus not do any exposure therapy, that's what I do. The removal of safety behaviors for inhibitory learning, for safety learning, is key. So safety behaviors are these behaviors or objects that are utilized to prevent that bad outcome. So if someone has panic disorder and they carry Xanax with them everywhere they go, or a water bottle with them everywhere they go, safety behavior. Social anxiety, a lot of my Cal Poly students who come to me for social anxiety issues, one of the things that they almost 100% of them are doing when they come to see me is before they go to a party, for example, they pregame. And if you don't know what pre-gaming means, that means they get drunk with their friends before they go to the party, or they have a few shots themselves before they go. I had one student who was an architecture student where you have to do a lot of presentations. And she would right before the presentation, she would have 5 shots of vodka before the presentation, which was so impressive to me because 5 shots of vodka and I'm passed out because I don't drink. And I would be under the table with 5 shots of vodka. She needed to wean off of that. And generally, clients are much more they're much more willing to wean off safety behaviors than they are cold turkey. Now, one of the stories that I tell to my clients to help them understand why safety behaviors are problematic is I talk about if someone has a phobia of vampires, for example. They got this phobia of vampires. Let's say a friend of yours has a phobia of vampires, and they're avoiding going out after dark because nighttime is where the vampires come out. And if they have to go out at all, they carry a big metal cross and they're scanning their environment like this. They bathe only in holy water and they wear cloves of garlic as a necklace anytime they leave their house. And you ask your friend, how's that working for you? And they say, oh my God, it works so good. I have not been attacked by a single vampire, right? So it confuses anxiety to do these safety behaviors because they think that they need to do these things or else. Some of the safety behaviors that people do, these are common behaviors. And so when you're kind of doing that functional analysis to see what safety behaviors do they need to practice letting go of, some of them can be pretty reasonable things that we do. So I carry my cell phone with me everywhere. It's really normal to carry a bottle of water, particularly in certain climates. The question is, are they doing these things because it's just a preference? Are they carrying a water bottle with them because they just like to be hydrated and they think it's just good health practice? Or is anxiety saying, you better not leave your phone at home, you better have that water or else? And so if anxiety thinks these things are a matter of life or death, then some of the exposures, we're going to have them go, go drive to the grocery store, not bring your cell phone. And when you suggest that to young people now, they can imagine leaving their home without a cell phone. It's like, the past millions of years of going places without a cell phone was never a thing, right? So we want to be able to help them to teach their anxiety these things are unnecessary. And once they teach anxiety that carrying the cell phone everywhere isn't life or death, then they can do whatever they want, which is, I think, will be to carry their cell phone. But once they learn that they don't have to have it or else, then they can do what they want. So inhibitory learning states that the real active ingredient in exposure therapy is violating anxiety's expectancies. So anxiety thinks a certain thing is dangerous, and you got to stay away from it. And it's not about, again, habituation, but let's say anxiety thinks that dogs, if you're around a dog, you're going to die, right? Let's say that anxiety thinks that. And it says, don't do the exposure, don't do the exposure. But you spend an hour with the dog and the anxiety goes, oh, wait, I thought that was dangerous. And it doesn't seem to be so dangerous. I stand corrected, right? That's considered to be the most important factor in exposure therapy is anxiety learns something that it didn't know and having that expectancy violated. So how do we do this? So before you help a client face a fear, before you do an exposure therapy, you're going to ask them, what do you think will happen when we bring the dog into the room? And they say, well, I'm really, my anxiety says the dog's going to kill me. All right. How tolerable do you or does your, I usually ask, what is your anxiety guard dog thinks going to happen? What does your anxiety guard dog How tolerable does your anxiety guard dog think that will be on a scale of 0 to 10? Because these things are phobic processes, and so people often know they'll be okay, right? If they stand at a high place with a balcony, logically they know they're going to be okay, but their inner guard dog says they're going to die, right? So we ask them, what's the prediction of what's going to happen, and what's the prediction of how tolerable it will be? Now, during the exposure, for most of the time, you're going to keep them focused. You're going to redirect them when they start to distract themselves, like walking with the client with social anxiety in downtown, and you see that they're staring at the ground, right? We're going to keep them focused. We're going to redirect them. So you're watching your clients. And we're going to also be watching for subtle or not so subtle safety behaviors and clue the client. So you see them gritting their teeth. You see them holding their breath. You see them balling up their fists. You see them clutching their purse or whatever, right? And we're going to point that out because we want them to again, face the fears with as minimal safety behaviors as possible. Now, my one exception for the keeping them focused on the threat thing is I think it can be good for certain clients in certain situations. Occasionally engage them in irrelevant conversation during the exposure, because let's say that you have a client who's terrified to drive, for example. And so you're driving with them and they're really, really nervous. And every once in a while, being able to we drive by something and you come around, yeah, you ever been to that restaurant? I say, oh yeah, that's a good restaurant. My kids love it when I take them to that restaurant. And you ask a few questions and, you let a minute or two go by. And then you point out that, did you notice how even though with that anxiety there, you were able to kind of chat about your kids for a minute, right? So you're not doing it to distract them, but you're doing that for them to learn that I can be really anxious and I can still function. I can be at a party and I can have that social anxiety and I can still have conversations with people, right? That's good safety learning. After the exposure, we review what was the prediction, what actually happened, how tolerable. What do you make of that? So you're really trying to get them to think about that and to really process that this thing was actually surprisingly not so dangerous. So we want our clients to learn that anxiety is tolerable. And that involves teaching them not to struggle, not to fight, because when you struggle and fight with your anxiety, it can feel intolerable. When we hold it softly and mindfully without judgment, it's much more tolerable. We want our clients to learn that what their anxiety predicted was going to happen didn't come true. Now, the old school way of doing exposure therapy, at least how I was trained, was, let's say our goal was we're going to go for a walk in downtown with a client, and they're going to this is kind of a common exposure. They're going to wear, I don't know, a funny shirt or something like that they worry will get people's attention or things like that. The old strategy was to do cognitive restructuring. So what are the odds that would happen? What are the odds people are going to notice? And wouldn't that be catastrophizing and things like that? We would do that ahead of time so that we're kind of calming people down before they go. The newer, more inhibitory learning strategy is we want the surprise. We want that, aha, wow, that's surprising. We want that to happen. Then afterwards is that cognitive component where you're going to go, what did you make of that, right? You thought that this was going to happen, and what actually happened? So the next thing is we need to change up the variables. So remember, we said that anxiety learns threat broadly, but it learns safety kind of in a piecemeal way. So if someone gets bit by a dog and they develop a dog phobia, and I bring my dog, my King Charles Cavalier dog, into my office for exposure therapy, they're going to learn that, this one dog named Wally at noon in the therapy office with the therapist present is safe. But all other dogs, for different times and different contexts, I'm not so sure about those. So we need to be doing different breeds of dogs, different sizes, temperaments, time of day, location, sometimes with someone, sometimes alone, sometimes a difficult, like maybe a friendly pit bull, and sometimes it's a cute little poodle. Vary the duration. Sometimes you do exposure just for a couple minutes, sometimes for a half an hour. And then we can, as we help clients face these individually, we can then combine exposures for deeper learning. So let's say that someone is agoraphobic and they're terrified to go out in public. So you might do an exposure where you go with them to the mall, or you have them go for homework to the mall. And that's the exposure. But, they also have this kind of panic disorder-y sort of thing, and they're afraid of their anxiety symptoms. So maybe in session, you drink a cup of coffee with them to where now they get that feared caffeine jolt, and you have them sit with that. Well, then to create deeper learning, we have them go to the mall, get a coffee, and sit at the mall and drink your coffee. So you're combining those exposures. So the combined exposures deepen learning. Now, the other thing that can be really helpful is, when it's appropriate, allow for the quote bad thing to happen. Now, I think about like some of my clients who are phobic of dating. I'll work with people who are in their 30s, 40s. They're so terrified of rejection that they've never asked anyone out on a date, because the idea of rejection is that it's going to be humiliating and utterly intolerable. One of the absolute best things can happen, believe it or not, when they finally get the courage to ask someone out, is that they get rejected. Because what happens is, in their minds, the rejection is this sadistic sort of, why would I ever go out with you sort of thing, the humiliating and terrible. And what actually happens, right? When you ask someone out and you get rejected, they say, oh, no, thank you, I got a boyfriend, or they say, oh, I already have plans, or something like that. It's some face-saving sort of thing, typically, unless you're asking a psychopath out, right? And so that is incredibly wonderful safety learning, to get that rejection when you are terrified of rejection. Or if someone is terrified of panic attacks, as in panic disorder, every once in a while actually having a panic attack and coping adaptively with it, right? You got to teach them how not to fight it, right? But sit with it in a more mindful sort of way. And they realize every so often that they can handle a panic attack. Yeah, I don't like them. They're unpleasant. But I teach myself time and time again that I can get through them, right? That's more powerful than the person with panic disorder that goes years without a panic attack, and they begin to think, oh my God, it better not come back. I can't handle it. And it becomes this real demon thing again. We also can help our clients do exposure therapy, changing up internal variables. And so our clients, when they're doing exposure therapy, they're going to want to do it when it feels just right? They want to, so I'll go to the party when I got a good night's sleep and I didn't drink caffeine and I just feel good today. So I think I can go do my exposure, right? but those are safety behaviors, and that's going to be a drag on safety learning. And so using opportunities when they didn't sleep well, maybe, drink extra caffeine, or when someone is a little bit sick and let's say they have a driving phobia, and they're a little bit sick, that's a wonderful time to go out and drive somewhat, right? Because then they learn they can handle it. And I think about, with my public speaking phobia, one of the things that helped the most was there was a night, and this was pre-COVID, where I guest lectured for someone, and I was really sick. And I knew it was not going to be my best performance. And nothing happened. They said, thank you for coming. They asked me to come and do it again sometime. And it was okay. I felt terrible. Or there's times when I've presented at conferences when, because of late travel, I had hardly slept, and it went good enough. And that's huge. So changing up that internal variables is a wonderful strategy. So some additional exposure tips. Don't look at anxiety showing up as bad. And what I tell people, and this is consistent with my understanding of the science, is anxiety needs to be awake in order to learn something new. So if you're doing exposure therapy and you're feeling anxious, good, you have your anxiety, it's awake, it's taking notes, it's learning something new. And that's a good thing. When people take a bunch of benzodiazepines and then they do exposure therapy, research has shown they don't benefit nearly as much because you've put your inner guard dog to sleep. So it's not going to learn new things. So we look at it as, not something that we're supposed to feel good. We don't enjoy anxiety when it shows up, but we see it as something that's useful and beneficial. We want to help our clients with exposure therapy be consistent. So if you want to get in shape, but you go to the gym once a month for 15 minutes, it's going to take a very long time, if ever, right? So we want consistency. We want people to reward positive steps. They do exposure, pat themselves on the back, go and have their favorite coffee, drink, whatever, right? We also want people to have a good defensive exposure approach as well as offense. So you have to have a good offense and defense to win. And so defensive strategy means things are going to come up. So offensive exposure therapy is, if I'm socially anxious, I'm going to call 10 friends to chat when my brain says that's scary, I might get rejected. But the defensive strategy is, somebody calls me up and they say, hey, I'm having this party, do you want to come? And my initial instinct, because of social anxiety, is to say, no, thank you, I have plans. We want to have a good defensive game and say yes to those things, to lean into those things. All exposure therapy should be an exercise in mindfulness and willingness. We need to open up to the feelings so that we're not going to war, which is going to make us suffer more and teach threat. Sometimes, however, a menu item someone chooses for exposure feels more overwhelming than what they're willing to open up to. If that's the case, it's okay for them to pick something that they're more willing to do. And by willing, I don't mean willing to just to do it, but willing to do it with being open to the experience. It can be helpful to shift from a threat mindset oh my God, I hate this. This is scary, to, hey, good for me. Good for me. This is great, right? I'm facing a fear. That's hard. It is hard to face a fear. Good for me. That's using a more compassionate mindset. And then, of course, reminding yourself, why am I facing this fear? How is that going to benefit my life? So if I face my fear of public speaking, then I get to help more people doing something like this. And that's values-based for me. And so going through the pain of exposure therapy was important. And we do that to help motivate people. And then, of course, we evaluate our progress and modify accordingly. So is our anxiety guard dog howling less frequently and less intensely during the same triggers over time? Are you able to respond more flexibly in situations where anxiety arises, right? And are you turning and facing the experience of anxiety more often rather than running from it and fighting it? And if you're moving in that direction, then that's great. You're on the right track. So ultimately, and I tell this to my clients, I tell this to my students when I'm teaching this stuff. This isn't about exposure therapy for the sake of exposure therapy. It's not about what's the most challenging thing I can get my client to do, right? What's the hardest thing I can put myself into. The goal is to be free to live your life without anxiety putting any boundaries or restrictions on you. That's what the goal is. And whatever it takes to get there, that's what's important. I don't think you necessarily even need to go through your whole exposure menu. Once you get to the place where, all right, I can handle my anxiety, it's not slowing me down, it's not stopping me. And I feel like I'm suffering less when anxiety shows up. So that's what I look at as, this is what we're striving for. Okay, now I am ready for any questions people have.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat box and we can direct them to Dr. Goodman, or you can just now go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I only do work in the office, not like walking around with clients, taking them to class that they're afraid to go to. What advice do you have for exposure in that kind of a environment?
Yeah, and so in those situations, it can be helpful if they find, and I a client yesterday who has claustrophobia really bad, and what we've been working on is going into elevators. And I have not been able to get him to do exposure therapy between sessions. Now, challenge getting your clients to do exposure therapy. That's the rule, not the exception, right? That's the art of therapy, is how do we get past those challenges. And so in those situations, if there's, like in this person's case, he's got a very supportive spouse who's really wants to get on a plane and go travel again. This guy hasn't been on a plane in 15 years. And so I'm going to recruit someone close to him in his life, with his willingness and permission to help, to be an exposure aid between sessions. And that can be invaluable. When you're working with kids, you're not going to get anywhere without teaching a caregiver how to do this and having them be the therapist, quote unquote, between sessions. You just, in my experience, unless they're, real motivated adolescents, it's going to be really important to have someone. And with adolescents, sometimes that's a best friend and not a parent because of developmental reasons. I hope that explains that. Let me see. My question is regarding the frequency. Let me start with the first one. We got so many questions.
Yeah, there's several.
Are there particular trainings you recommend for working on being competent with exposure therapy? Yeah, there's a lot of them. I highly recommend the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Their conference is how I really learned to become a specialist. I mean, I was working my first job out of my PhD program was I'm an anxiety specialist, but I was just pretty well trained in it, but I wasn't really a specialist. ADAA was where I really got good at. That's really where I got the training. If you want to work with OCD, the International Obsessive Compulsive Foundation is a wonderful source of training. Their conference is also excellent. So I recommend both of those very highly. Can suicidal ideation be a safety behavior? That's a wonderful question. It can be. Certainly, it can be used to get attention. It can be used to shut down exposure therapy because, rather than facing my fear, I'm just going to kill myself, right? And it's kind of it's almost a trump card, because if a client is saying that they're suicidal, that does take our attention away from exposure therapy and focuses on safety planning and safety analysis. So yeah, that absolutely can be a safety behavior. Let me see. How is this different with trauma? That's a great question. If the stimulus is feared because it's associated with trauma. So when I teach a class to master students on exposure therapy, and we have a night where we talk about PTSD and anxiety related to trauma. So I think it's more complicated than run-of-the-mill phobic stuff. And I think it's more complicated because of what Bessel van der Kolk talks about. If you've read his book, the body keeps score. I think with trauma, there's just a lot more stuff that is embodied, that's just kind of trapped. And so, yeah, if someone was in a car accident and they're afraid of driving, they're going to have to do the exposure therapy around the memories. They're going to have to go driving, maybe visit the scene of the accident, things like that. But they may also likely need to do things like, yoga or other body-based sort of things to help their bodies kind of deal with that embodied stuff. Now, my expertise slightly goes off the rail there compared to someone who's a trauma expert, but that's my understanding. I think you got to do the exposure therapy, but I think you also need to address some deeper body-based stuff. My questions regarding the frequency of sessions, exposures for effectiveness. I know some clinicians will be more than weekly, but this is not feasible for any folks. So this really varies based on, I think how severe the anxiety disorder is, and how much they're able to motivate themselves to take action on their own. And so it varies tremendously. There are some people, like I'll get 1 or 2 clients a year, they just will not do exposure therapy on their own. They just won't do it. And because their OCD, for example, is so severe, meeting once a week for exposure therapy in my office, it's just not enough. It's not high enough dosage of treatment. And so every year I'll send 1, 2, 3 people to either intensive outpatient programs that are like 4 to 6 hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week, where it's just a lot more hand holding. Or in some cases, I'll even send people to like McLean Hospital's residential anxiety OCD treatment program, where they're going to get treatment 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And it's just kind of a judgment call at what point. But if you're doing exposure therapy and 2, 3 months passes by and they're just not able to make that progress in standard outpatient therapy, then referring them elsewhere is if they're able to, if they're privileged enough to have access to that, can be profoundly life-changing. What about a client that is using drugs and alcohol to manage their anxiety and how to safely remove? Yeah, these are wonderful questions.
Dr. Goodman, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry to interrupt you very briefly. I just want to say, because I see it's 1:30, I'm aware some of you may have other things to attend to. We'll stay and answer these questions for the next few minutes, but I did drop the evaluation link in the chat box. So if you want to fill that out, then you can get your CE credits, and any questions, just let me know. Okay, back to you, Dr. Goodman.
So historically, if you would have gone on to the websites of people who are anxiety OCD specialists, myself included, you see on there that if you actively have a problem with alcohol or drugs, we won't be able to treat you until you treat that first. And I think in general, best practice is to get that under control first. It's just not always feasible because for some people, they're just numbing out their phobic thing. They're terrified of people and they have to leave their house to go to work every day. And they can't do that, they think, without, getting high. And so, yeah, more and more, I'm working with people who are smoking cannabis daily. And my goal is always to try to get them to wean down, wean off, because the first step is to educate them. If your anxiety guard dog is sleeping, it can't learn that something is safe. It needs to be awake, alert. It needs to take in that something bad isn't happening in order for you to feel better in the long run. Let me see. How to proceed if a client does a safety behavior during exposure and doesn't want to, isn't able to stop. Well, of course, you never force anyone. You educate, you encourage. And if they're just not able to do an exposure without the safety behaviors. Now, if it's a transitional safety behavior, so for example, you have a client that hasn't left their home in a year because they're severely agoraphobic, it's a safety behavior to have them go walk around the block with their parent or with a friend or whatever. That's a safety behavior. But I look at that as a transitional safety behavior. The goal is to get them off that at some point so they don't just learn, I can only handle it if I have that person with me. And here's the kicker. therapists become safety behaviors for their clients when they're just doing exposure therapy with the therapist present. Eventually, their anxiety is going to think, wait, I'm safe every time the therapist is there, but I may not be able to handle it without the therapist. So sometimes you got to leave the room. You certainly need them to practice without us present. And if there's a certain thing and you really think they need to not do the safety behavior because it's interfering with their learning, then I would have them pick an easier exposure and do it in a way that's going to be more helpful for learning than to do a harder exposure to where they just can't do it without teaching threat. Can you say the name of the program again for learning anxiety you mentioned first? That was the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, ADAA. Website is adaa.org, and it is excellent. Oh, somebody put that right underneath. Oh, thank you. All right. Well, I think our timing was actually spot on. That's always my fear in giving these things, that I'm going to have either way too little material or way too much material. But I think we just kind of hit the nail on the head. So I really appreciate everybody for coming to this. And Christy, thank you for setting this up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Goodman. It was great to learn from you, and thank you all so much for being here. And feel free to reach out at any time with questions, or if you need anything, you know where to find me. And thank you again, Dr. Goodman. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Happy New Year, everyone. I'll close it now. Bye.